Hey, I'm Courtney Waterman, your tutor. Lover of anime, manga, and math. And you just tuned into another session of Tutor Me Sempai. Welcome back, everyone. Today we're jumping into a 9th grade topic, simplifying radicals. Now, if you're new to my channel, I'll be putting timecodes in for this video in the description box below, so use that to skip ahead to whatever part of the video you think is most interesting. As always, if you have any question about what we see here today or even your own homework, you can put it in the comment box below or visit me on my Facebook page at Tutor Me Sempai and tell me all about it there. Now we have a lot to cover, so hit the like button, smash the subscribe button, and let's get started. Before we jump straight into simplifying radicals, I have a few recommendations I'd like to cover first. Now, the very first recommendation I have for you today is know what a radical is. It's going to be very hard to simplify something that you don't understand. So, know what a radical is. Now, I have a hard time believing you would see this video or be interested in this video if you have no idea what a radical is. However, if there's any kind of confusion you may have and you don't necessarily understand it as you would like, I recommend taking a pause on this video, go checking out another video that tells you what you need to know about a radical, and I have one just for that purpose, and you can find it right up here. It breaks down pretty much what you need to know about your radicals, and you can come back to this one and you figure out how to simplify them. So the first recommendation, know what a radical is. So the second recommendation I have for you today is going to be something that's going to be super helpful when you're simplifying certain radicals. And that's going to be knowing your perfect squares and your perfect cubes, or at least knowing a good chunk of them. If you know a good amount of your perfect squares and your perfect cubes, that's going to make simplifying your square roots and your cube roots much faster. Now, I said this is only going to be good for certain radicals because this only pertains to your square roots and your cube roots. This doesn't really help when you're dealing with fourth roots or anything higher than that. That's where we get our third recommendation. If you're really not sold on this second recommendation, you don't even need to worry. You can skip this second one and go straight to the third one, and that's knowing prime factorization. If you know how to break down your number into its prime factors, you don't even need the second recommendation, and this is going to work for all your radicals. So once you have these recommendations down, or at least the first and the last one, you'll be ready to simplify your radicals. So let's jump into a very easy example to see how knowing a good amount of perfect squares will be useful. Here we have the square root of 18. Now, if you recall in my last video on what a radical is, you don't necessarily have to see the index for a square root. We know that's an understood 2. So this is our square root of 18. And in that last video, we also covered our perfect radicals. And that's going to be when we have one number that when multiplied by itself, the index many times, gets you your radicand. And remember, the radicand is going to be what's under your square root sign. So in this case, 18 is going to be our radicand. Is this going to be a perfect radical? Or in this case, a perfect square? Well, this is where knowing your perfect squares is going to be very helpful. Let's list our first couple perfect squares and see if this fits in that category. So we have 1, we have 4, we have 9, we have 16, we have 25. Well, it seems like we passed 18, so we can stop there. So these are going to be our first 5 perfect squares, and 1 is going to be 1 times 1. 4 is 2 times 2, 3 times 3, 4 times 4, 5 times 5. So 18 is not going to be what we consider a perfect square. So we can't necessarily say this is going to be some constant like we did in our previous video. This is why we have to simplify instead of simply solving this radical. In order to simplify this, the goal is to reduce the radicand to a smaller number as we possibly can, and we're going to introduce a coefficient out front. Now you might be asking, how do I simplify? We already covered that this is not a perfect square. We looked at our first 5, so how is this going to be useful in determining how to simplify this square root? Well, we want to break our radicand up into its factors. And if you can choose one of those factors to be a perfect square, in this case, because we're dealing with square root, that's going to save you a ton of time. So knowing what your perfect squares are will automatically put you ahead, maybe even a couple of seconds when you're doing these kind of questions. If you can pick a factor that's a perfect square, it's going to just naturally fall out, and I'll show you how. So in this case, let's look at our perfect squares and determine which one of these is going to be a factor of 18. Well, is it going to be 25? No. Is it going to be 1? Yes, but 1 being a factor doesn't really help. We want something that's going to reduce this. However, we don't want necessarily anything. So we don't want to just use 1, because when you break this into 1 and whatever you need to get this again, which is going to be another 18, you're back at 18 where you started. So we don't want 1. So we can effectively ignore 1 as your perfect square. So any one of these, we want 9. 9 is going to be a factor of this that's going to reduce it. So let's reduce this into its factors. 9 times what is going to give us 18? 9 times 2. 9 times 2 gives us 18, and everything is still under the square root. So how does this look any simpler than what we had before? Now we have multiplication. It seems like it's getting more complicated. Well, that's where we get into the next trick for radicals. This is a really cool trick, but in order to make you understand what's going to happen, let's look at it in a rather different sense. Imagine your radicand is a family and the root sign is a house. So your family is living inside this house here. And your family can be made of multiple people, your factors. So you can have them all together as one big family, or you can kind of break them apart into your individual family members. Now, there might come a time where some part of the family wants to move out. Let's say there's any kids in there. They want to move out and start a house of their own. So instead of staying in this house, they want to have their own house. So you split up the family. However, each one gets their own house. But in order to make this true, you have to keep the operation the same. So each one gets their own house, and now you see how this can potentially get much simpler than what we had up here. So the property of radicals, whenever you have factors multiplied together, is that they can get their own radical. And that's going to be very helpful if you can isolate the perfect square or the perfect radical, in case this is not a square root. If you can isolate the perfect square, you can simply write that answer in, and we know the square root of 9 to be 3. 3, when multiplied by itself 2 times, gives you 9. So the answer for this one is going to be 3, and the square root of 2 stays the same. We don't have anything that will go into the square root of 2. So our answer for this is going to be 3 times, this is going to be a multiplication still, the square root of 2. So you see, if you understand your perfect squares, you can make this much simpler by isolating the perfect square that's a factor of your radicand. You don't even have to look at the other factors or break things down into your prime factorizations for your square roots or your cube roots if you know your perfect squares or your perfect cubes. Let's look at another example. So in this example, we're looking at the cube root of 750. And you see here, I've already given you your first 9, excluding your 1s, because 1 doesn't change anything, so we're just going to ignore that. But we're going to see the first 9 perfect cubes. And you look at this, our radicand of 750, and you see that it's not a perfect cube. So the goal is going to be relatively the same. We want to break this up into its factors, and if we can find a factor that's a perfect cubed of this, so we can isolate it and simply find our answer just like that. So which one of these perfect cubes would go into a 750? Well, the answer is going to be this one right here. We want to break this cube root of 750 into 125, and then what do you multiply by in order to get 750? Well, that's going to be 6. So 125 times 6 gives you 750. Now remember, these are your family members, and now they want to leave the house and get their own house. So you have the cube root of 125 times the cube root of 6. Make sure you don't lose your cube root index. I don't want you to have a cube root and all of a sudden have square roots when you start breaking things apart. It doesn't change the index. In fact, you have to have the same index in order for this to work. So we know 125 is a perfect cube. What's the answer for that? 5. Is 6 a perfect cube? No. And it seems like 6 is too small to have anything go into. You can't break that up into more factors that could potentially be perfect cubes. So you can leave this as it is. So it's going to be 5 times the cube root of 6. And now you've taken the cube root of 750, simplified it to simply this. So you see, knowing a good chunk of your perfect squares and your perfect cubes can be very helpful because you can simply break apart your factors into the perfect part and the non-perfect part, and you can get your answer for half of it very easily while leaving the other one alone. But what happens if you don't know your perfect squares or your perfect cubes, or you have a root that's higher than 3? Well, that's when prime factorization comes into play. So let's look at this once again without looking at our perfect cubes, but instead focusing on prime factorization. So remember, prime factorization wants us to find all the factors. So I'm going to write 750 up here, and we're going to just start breaking down this into a nice little tree to figure out what all the prime factors are. Now you might not know what the best factor is, and it really doesn't matter. You're going to break it all down anyway, so find something that's going to be easy to you. We know that if it ends with a 0, you can easily put a 2 there, cut it in half because it's even, or simply make a larger chunk by going 10. So let's do 10. So it's going to be 10 times 75 will give us 750. Now we can break down this 10 into a 5 times 2 and the 75 into a 25 times 3, right? So those are going to be the factors there. Well, can you break down this 5 or this 2? No. Can you break down this 25 or this 3? Yes. You can break down 25. 25 can break down to 5 times 5. Can you break down to 3? No. So this is going to be our prime factorization. 5, 2, 5, 5, 3. These 5 factors are going to be the prime factorization of 750. So how does this help us when we're trying to find our simplest form of this radical? Well, whatever your index is, that's how you want to group your prime factorization. If you have anything that's the same that many times, you want to put them all under one radical. So you have how many 5s? You have 3 5s. That's our group of 3 here, right? So we're going to put all 3 of these under one radical. Now what's left? You have a 2 here. How many 2s? Only 1. So that can get its own radical, but you only have a 3 left. So let's put both of those together because that's what's left over. If you have anything just left over, you can't group them into 3s, then put them all in the same radical. So this is going to be 2 times 3. So we know that this 2 times 3 is going to be the cube root of 6. And we know this 5 times 5 times 5 is going to be the cube root of 125. Now, you don't even have to do this step right here because you have these 3 that you know when you multiply them 3 times, that's going to give you a perfect cube. And you're looking for a cube root. This is going to be your answer. So you can technically skip this step and go directly to this step. Bring this down. And you see that you don't even need to know your perfect cubes in order to do this if you know how to find your prime factorization of these numbers. So let's look at another example of prime factorization in which you wouldn't necessarily know a higher perfect exponent. So here we have the 5th root of 224. So we want to dive straight into finding the prime factorization of our radicand. And even if you don't know what all the factors would be, you know that this is even, so 2 has to be a factor. So 2 is going to break this up into 112. This is also even, so you know this can break down into 2 and something else, in which that something else is going to be 56. 56 is also even, so you can break this up into 2 times 28. 28 is also even, so 2 times 14. 14 is even, so this is going to be 2 times 7. And none of these can be broken down anymore. These are now your prime factorization. And remember, our index is going to say how we want to group these. This is no longer a cube root, it's a fifth root. So instead of grouping them into groups of 3s, we want to group them into groups of 5s. So how many 2s do we have? We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It seems like we have exactly 5. So let's put all of those under 1/5 root. Now what's left over? A 7. So that gets its own 5th root. And remember, you broke this up into your perfect and your non-perfect, so you don't even have to worry about doing any extra steps here. We can simply write the answer for this to be 2. And this is our non-perfect. There's nothing else we can do with this, so we simply bring it down, and that's going to be 2 times the 5th root of 7. We have now simplified the 5th root of 224 to be 2 times the 5th root of 7. Now there's going to be more things that we can use to simplify radicals because radicals show up in a lot of different forms. However, those are going to be tackled in later videos, especially when you're dealing with multiplying and dividing radicals. You're going to see some pretty interesting things there that are going to allow us to simplify in different ways. But simplifying a radical in itself is going to boil down to simply this. So I hope you're following to the examples, and I hope you realize that simplifying your radicals can boil down to simply knowing your prime factorizations. If you have any question about what you started today, or even your own homework, remember you can always put them in the comment box below, or simply visit me on my Facebook page at Tutor Me Sempai and tell me about it there. If you haven't done so already, remember to leave a like. It really helps this channel by letting YouTube know that this video provided you with some assistance, and it can also be helpful to somebody else. So leave that like, hit the notification bell, smash the subscribe button, and share this video with a friend. Well, that's all the time I have for today. I'm really hoping it's helped with your homework, and I'm looking forward to seeing you again next week. I'm Courtney, and this is another session of Tutor Me Sempai.